There are wounds time can't erase, and hearts that forget how to hope. But sometimes, when everything seems lost, life sends someone who changes everything, not with promises, but with presence. Today, you'll hear the story of a woman who was abandoned at 53 and found love in the most unexpected place. The cracked asphalt seemed endless. The wind lifted fine dust that clung to Clara's loose, disheveled hair. She gripped the small blue suitcase tightly, the same one she had packed so carefully that morning. Inside, every folded piece of clothing wasn't just fabric, it was hope. Hope for a new beginning, for a home, for love. She looked down the empty road, trying to believe that at any moment she would see the car of the man who had promised her a future. They had agreed. After months of letters and phone calls full of promises, he would pick her up there, at that forgotten point on the map. Clara had believed every word, every vow of affection. But time passed, and no one came. Clara could still hear the driver's harsh voice when he stopped the car and said, "This is where your trip ends." She didn't understand at first. She laughed, nervously. "What do you mean? He's not coming to get me here?" The man just shook his head, impatient. "Lady, I just do what I'm told. Get out." And that was it. The car sped away, leaving a trail of dust that made her cough. And there she was, at 53 years old, standing by the side of an empty road with her suitcase, no one around, her eyes filled with tears. Again, Clara. Fooled again. How could you still believe? She sat on a rock, feeling the hot sun burn her face. The silence of the road was haunting, broken only by the distant cry of a crow. Inside, the memory of that last phone call echoed. The sweet voice of a man who had promised a future, promises of marriage, of a shared life. Words that now sounded hollow, like shattered glass on the ground. Clara ran her fingers over the fake wedding ring she had bought with her own savings. It wasn't gold, it had no value, but to her it had symbolized faith. Now it was only a cruel reminder. "I really am a fool," she whispered softly. Her heart ached. More than shame, it was fear. Fear of being alone, fear of having nowhere to go, fear that maybe the world was right, that for a woman her age, love no longer had a place. The sun began to sink on the horizon, painting the sky orange. And that was when Clara heard, in the distance, the sound of an engine. It wasn't the same car as before. This sound was different, deep, steady. An old truck, faded burgundy in color, was slowly approaching. The engine growled, but there was strength in its tone. Clara stood up, hesitant. She clutched her suitcase to her chest as if it were a shield. The truck stopped a few meters away. The door creaked as it opened, and a tall man stepped down, worn jeans, a light cotton shirt, and a straw hat already aged by time. He looked at her with a mix of surprise and concern. His eyes, clear and deep, carried the weight of years lived. There were lines on his face, but none of them hardened his expression. On the contrary, they gave him serenity. "Good afternoon, ma'am," he said in a deep but gentle voice. "Are you all right out here alone?" Clara swallowed hard, unsure of what to say. Part of her wanted to run, part wanted to scream, and another part wanted to believe that maybe, just maybe, someone had appeared, not to take her away, but to truly see her. That man was Edward Collins, and without her knowing it, that simple question would be the beginning of a story capable of changing everything. Clara didn't answer right away. Her heart was pounding so hard she feared the stranger might hear it. "Are you all right?" he had asked, and inside her the answer was a scream. "No, nothing is all right." But her mouth managed only a trembling whisper. I'm waiting for someone." Edward adjusted his hat, studying her carefully. There was sincerity in his gaze, but also the cautiousness of someone who already knew the silences of the world. "Here?" he asked, raising an eyebrow. "This road hardly ever sees anyone pass." His words cut like a knife. Clara took a deep breath, trying not to cry in front of a stranger. Her teary eyes searched for a point on the horizon, but what she saw instead were memories, flashbacks mingled with the dry wind that blew. She remembered the first letter she had received, a simple envelope stamped with the seal of a small town. The sender, a man named James, who claimed to be a widower and lonely. He wrote about simple things, the crops he tended, the cold nights he spent alone, the hope of finding someone to share life with. Clara had felt seen. For the first time in a long while, someone seemed to look beyond her age, beyond the marks time had left on her face. Then came more letters. Words that painted pictures of a peaceful life in the countryside, a house with a porch, hot coffee at dawn. And when the letters turned into phone calls, his voice seemed to bring warmth to her lonely nights. "You're everything I've ever hoped for, Clara. I promise I'll take care of you. Come, our future begins here." Those phrases now echoed like mockery. Clara felt her stomach twist. She held the suitcase tighter against her chest, as if clinging to the promises that had already vanished. Edward didn't push. He simply took a step back, respecting her space. "If you'd like, I can wait here with you for a while. It's not safe to be out here alone, especially with the sun going down." Clara looked at him for a moment. There was something unsettling about that man's calmness. He didn't seem in a hurry. He didn't seem to want anything in return. But she had believed before. And look where she was now. "Thank you, but that's not necessary," she said, almost in a whisper. He nodded politely. "As you wish." And he slowly returned to his truck, leaning against the door. He didn't leave. He simply stayed there, as if his quiet presence were a kind of guard. A tear slipped down Clara's cheek, but she didn't allow herself to fall apart. "I came all this way for love, and all I got in return was silence." Night began to fall, painting the sky purple and gold. And with the darkness came a question that pulsed painfully in her chest. If he didn't come, where do I go now? The sun had almost disappeared when Clara realized that the silence of the road was even crueler than rejection itself. Every passing minute seemed to mock her hope. The suitcase felt heavy, not just in her arm, but in her heart. She had nowhere to return to. She had sold everything to chase that promise. No one was waiting for her in her hometown, only an empty house and bitter memories. Edward cleared his throat softly, like someone trying not to startle a wounded animal. "Ma'am, it's getting late." His voice was firm but not forceful. "This place isn't safe after dark." Clara pressed her lips together. Part of her wanted to scream, "I don't need anyone." But the other part, that part knew she did. She needed a roof, a glass of water, a chance to breathe without feeling the weight of rejection. "I don't know you," she said, her voice filled with suspicion. Edward didn't seem offended. He just rolled up his sleeves and replied, "Nor do I know you, but the world doesn't get any better when we shut ourselves off." The silence between them stretched long. Clara stared at the dirt beneath her feet, remembering her mother's words, "Trust is like crystal. Once it breaks, it's never the same again." Well, hers was already in pieces, but the cold wind was blowing hard, kicking up dust, and loneliness pressed on her like a stone. So she took a deep breath, looked into the stranger's eyes, and asked, "Where do you live?" Edward gestured toward the horizon, beyond the rolling hills. "About 15 minutes by car. Small farm. Nothing fancy, but there's hot soup and an extra bed." Clara hesitated, her mind waging a battle. Accepting meant exposing herself to another risk. Refusing meant condemning herself to face the night alone. He seemed to read the conflict on her face. "You don't have to decide now." He opened the truck door slowly. "But if you'd like a ride, I'll wait." And he stayed there, leaning against the truck, a man who offered but did not push. Clara looked down the road one last time, as if she could still see James's car appearing in the distance, but there was nothing, only darkness. She clutched the suitcase to her chest, took a deep breath, and took her first step toward the truck. Edward opened the passenger door. He didn't offer his hand. He simply left the gesture up to her. Clara climbed in slowly, her heart racing. As she closed the door, a shiver ran through her. She didn't know if it was fear or a timid sense of relief. The truck started slowly, raising a cloud of dust that quickly faded into the cold night air. Inside the cabin, the smell of worn leather mingled with the faint scent of wood smoke clinging to Edward's coat. Clara kept the suitcase on her lap as if it were a shield. Her eyes traced every detail, his large hands gripping the steering wheel, the sun-lined wrinkles on his face, the unhurried way he drove, as though the night held no power to scare him. To break the silence, Edward spoke first. "May I ask where you came from?" Clara hesitated. She didn't want to expose her wounds, but she didn't have the strength to lie either. Far enough, and too close to disappointment. He nodded. No smile, no mockery. "I understand." The two words hung in the air, carrying more weight than they seemed to. After a few minutes, Clara returned the question, even though part of her resisted. "And you? Have you always lived around here?" Edward took a deep breath, as if pulling old memories from somewhere deep inside. "Since I was a boy. My father's land. Most people left when the cattle stopped bringing profit, but I stayed. Loneliness can be a full-time job too." Clara was surprised by his honesty. Few men admitted loneliness out loud. The truck jolted as it turned a narrow bend, and for a moment she steadied herself on the dashboard. Edward noticed, but he didn't make a joke or comment. He simply slowed down, as if to show there was no rush to get anywhere. "You know, Miss Clara," he said, using her name for the first time, "sometimes life feels like a dance, where everyone's got a partner, except us." She swallowed hard. The sentence hit her right in the chest. "And when someone finally invites us," she murmured, "they never show up at the ballroom door." They exchanged a glance, and in that silence was something deeper than words, a quiet sharing of pain that needed no explanation. Outside, the stars began to appear, timidly, as if they wanted to listen to the conversation. Clara relaxed slightly, resting the suitcase on the floor. It wasn't full trust, but it was a thread. The gate creaked as Edward turned the truck onto the narrow dirt road. A little farther ahead, the silhouette of the house appeared against the starry sky. It wasn't big or grand, just a wooden structure with a small porch and a flickering yellow light spilling through the window. To Clara, it looked more like an old painting than a real home. Her chest tightened. After so many broken promises, that modest scene felt almost unbelievable. Edward stopped the vehicle and got out first. "Wait here, I'll get your suitcase." Clara gripped the door handle, uncertain. A thought flashed through her mind like lightning. What if I never leave this house? He opened the passenger door and offered his hand. But again, he didn't insist. He simply waited. Clara stepped down without taking it, steady, as if needing to prove to herself she could still stand on her own. On the porch, she noticed details that stirred her heart. A vase with dried flowers, a pair of worn-out boots by the door, and an old dog who lifted his head, wagging his tail slowly, as if approving the arrival of a new soul. "This is Duke," Edward said, scratching the animal's ears. "He doesn't bark much, but he knows who deserves trust." Hesitant, Clara reached out her hand. The dog pressed his nose against it without resistance. It was the first true gesture of welcome she had felt since arriving in that town. Inside the house, the smell of hot soup and baked bread filled her senses. The space was simple. Wooden furniture, linen curtains, a lit fireplace, but there was a quiet order to it, a sense of home. "Don't mind the mess," Edward said, though the place was perfectly tidy. Clara set her suitcase by the wall but kept her coat on. The warmth of the fire didn't erase the chill of mistrust. They sat at the table. Edward served soup into 2 clay bowls and placed a whole loaf of bread between them. "Eat. You don't need to say anything right now." Clara held the spoon but didn't bring it to her lips right away. Her eyes fixed on him. "Why are you doing this?" she asked, her voice barely a whisper. Edward looked at her for a moment. "Because I know what it's like to wait for someone who never comes." The words fell on her like both a weight and a relief. Clara tasted the soup. It was simple, but the flavor brought back memories of childhood, of times when someone had cooked for her, and for the first time that night, her tears came not from pain, but from exhaustion. Edward didn't comment, didn't stare. He simply let the silence of the fire speak for them both. The fire crackled, sending dancing shadows across the wooden walls. The silence stretched between them, but it wasn't uncomfortable. It was a silence that invited. Clara rested her elbows on the table, staring at the bowl of soup that had already gone cold. Her heart was beating fast, as if each thump forced another painful memory to the surface. "You know," she began hesitantly, "I spent months believing in the letters, in the pretty words. He said I would be the woman of his life." Edward didn't move a muscle. He simply lifted his gaze, attentive, giving her space to speak. "I sold things, saved up money for this trip. I believed that this time would be different." Clara drew a deep breath. "But I was just another fool." The word fool echoed bitterly in the air. Edward leaned back in his chair, crossing his arms. "A man who lies like that doesn't prove intelligence, only cowardice. The foolish one, Clara, wasn't you, it was him." She looked up, surprised by the firmness in his tone. A brief silence followed, until Edward, almost against his own will, let out quietly, "I waited for someone too, for a long time. My wife, she left, took our 2 little boys and went off to the big city. She wanted luxury, wanted more than I could give." Clara watched him, stunned. He went on, "I tried, searched for them, traveled after them, but I never managed to find them. Since then, it's just been this house and me." The words hung in the air, heavy, carrying the same weight as her own pain. 2 different abandonments, but both equally cruel. The dog lying by the fireplace let out a long sigh, as if confirming the unspoken confession. Clara dared a brief smile. "Looks like we're both experts in empty waiting." Edward returned the smile, subtle, almost imperceptible. "Maybe that's why Duke liked you so quickly." Clara let out a quiet laugh, unable to hold it back. It was the first time she'd laughed since the heartbreak. In that moment, something shifted in the air. It wasn't romance, not yet, but it was fertile ground for trust. A rare feeling, the sense of not being alone in her pain. The room where Edward had settled her was simple, yet warm. A wooden bed, a patchwork quilt, and a small table with a lantern on top. The window was open to the fields, letting in the sound of crickets and the damp scent of freshly watered soil. Clara closed the door softly, resting her forehead against the wood for a few seconds. The silence in the house seemed deafening, as if every creak of the floor echoed inside her chest. She sat on the edge of the bed and took off her shoes. But when she lay down, the weight of the pillow brought bitter memories flooding back. The face of the promised fiancé who never came. The letters she had kept like treasures that now felt like nothing more than scraps of paper stained with lies. She tried to hold back the tears, but they came anyway, silent and steady, soaking into the quilt. How could I believe? How did I end up here, alone, lost in a strange land, trusting men who only know how to deceive? A gust of wind blew through the window, making the lantern flicker. Her heart raced. For a moment, fear gripped her. Fear that she had walked into another trap, that Edward might just be another wolf in sheep's clothing. She stood and slammed the window shut, pressing her forehead to the cold glass as she stared into the dark fields beyond. Outside, everything looked vast, too vast for a woman alone. Then she heard something, not a threat. Music. From the living room, far away, came the soft sound of a guitar. Edward, alone, was plucking worn-out strings. The melody wasn't perfect, but it carried a sincere melancholy. Clara closed her eyes. For the first time in a long while, the feeling of danger gave way to something else, hope. She lay back down, letting the distant tune cradle her. Between tears and sighs, she drifted into sleep with an unfamiliar certainty that this house might hold more than sad memories. Perhaps it held a beginning. The sun rose lazily, painting the horizon in gold. Clara woke to the sound of roosters and the distant scent of freshly brewed coffee. It was far too early for someone who had spent so many nights sleepless, yet surprisingly she felt lighter. She went down the stairs slowly, her steps timid, as though afraid to intrude on a space that wasn't hers. She found Edward in the kitchen, already wearing an apron, setting eggs and bread on the table. "Good morning," he said without looking directly at her, as if not to embarrass her. "I hope you slept well." Clara pulled out a chair, a little shy. "Better than I expected, thank you." They shared breakfast in comfortable silence. When they finished, Edward wiped his hands on a towel and said, "I'll show you the farm today, if you'd like, of course." She hesitated. She didn't want to seem intrusive, but curiosity won. She followed him outside. The morning air hit her face, fresh and filled with scents, damp earth, hay, freshly milked cows. As they walked, Clara took in the vastness of it all. Barns, fences, a small orchard, even a well-kept garden. "All this by yourself?" she asked, surprised. Edward nodded. "Takes longer, but I manage, always have." Clara looked around, admiring the quiet discipline of that man, and for the first time, something inside her whispered, "Maybe I could start over here, too." When they reached the stable, Edward opened the door to reveal 2 dairy cows. "They're a lot of work," he said, "but they help me remember I can still care for something alive." Clara ran her hand over one of them, who responded gently. A timid smile escaped her lips. "I haven't done this since I was a girl." Edward glanced at her, saying nothing, but pride flickered in his eyes. The rest of the morning was filled with small tasks, collecting eggs, watering plants, tidying tools. Clara fumbled, laughed at herself, and Edward patiently corrected her every move without a trace of mockery. When they returned for lunch, Clara realized something unexpected. That morning, she hadn't thought about abandonment or pain. She had thought about living. Weeks went by, and Edward invited her to stay. That afternoon, the sun sank slowly, painting the fields in shades of orange. Clara was on the porch, folding some clothes Edward had left to dry. The silence of the farm was almost soothing, until a memory struck like thunder. Suddenly, she remembered the last man who had promised to take care of her. The sweet words in his letters, the convincing tone over the phone, and the emptiness of the road. Her body trembled. Edward appeared behind her, a bucket of tools in his hand. "Are you all right?" he asked, noticing the tension in her face. Clara took a deep breath. "I don't know if I can believe in anyone anymore, Edward." Her voice broke. "You seem too good. And I've heard that story before." He set the bucket down and crossed his arms. "Serious. I won't lie to you, Clara. I've got my flaws, and pains I don't share with just anyone. But if you think I'm here to deceive you, you're wrong." Clara turned her gaze away, as if searching for strength somewhere along the horizon. "Your wife, your children. What if she comes back one day? What if you're still waiting for them?" The question cut through the air like a blade. Edward took a while to respond. A shadow of pain crossed his face. "Clara, I waited for them for years. I chased after them, wrote letters, knocked on doors that never opened. But one day, I realized I couldn't keep living for someone who had already chosen to leave." He stepped closer, steady but without intruding on her space. I don't know what the future holds, but I know you deserve more than scraps. I don't want to be your replacement, and I don't want you to be mine." The words echoed inside her, too strong to ignore, too frightening to accept. Clara turned her back, her eyes brimming with tears. I don't know if I can, Edward. I don't know if I trust myself enough to trust you." The silence between them grew heavy, until Edward finally said, calmly, "Then don't trust me now, just walk with me. Time will tell the rest." Clara closed her eyes. Part of her wanted to run before she got hurt again, but another part, the tired one, just longed to rest in something real. The last few days had been different. After that conversation on the porch, Edward had respected her silence. He didn't pressure her, didn't ask for answers. He simply kept being there, fixing the fence, bringing in firewood, sharing warm bread at breakfast. He didn't say much, but his actions spoke louder than any words could. That Sunday morning, Edward appeared dressed simply yet neatly. A clean shirt, freshly shaven face, polished boots. He took a deep breath, adjusting his hat. "Clara," he began, his voice steadier than usual, "I can't promise a life without pain. I've lived long enough to know such a thing doesn't exist." Clara turned to him, surprised by the seriousness in his eyes. "But I can promise I won't leave." He took a step closer. "I already know what it feels like to be left behind, and I wouldn't wish that on anyone. If you'll let me, I want to be the home you never had." The words struck her like warm wind in the middle of winter. A single tear traced down her cheek. "And if I fail you," she whispered. Edward reached out his hand, slowly, leaving space for her choice. "Then we fail together, and we move on." Clara looked at that hand. Rough, calloused, but steady and true. It was different from the ones that had deceived her, the ones that had abandoned her. This one didn't promise luxury or perfection, it promised permanence. She took a deep breath and finally placed her hand in his. The touch was simple, yet carried the weight of a decision. It wasn't a fairy tale. It was real. Just then, sunlight streamed through the window, illuminating her face. Clara smiled, for the first time, without fear. Then, "Let's walk together." Edward smiled back, quiet but full of peace. "One step at a time, Clara." They stood there, hand in hand, while the world outside went on changing. There was no audience, no celebration, no applause. Just two survivors who chose to believe again, even after so many falls. Because, in the end, love isn't about perfection or impossible promises, it's about staying when leaving would be easier. And on that small piece of land, among blooming flowers and healed scars, Clara finally discovered that sometimes being rejected is just the road to finally being found. The human heart has no expiration date. Love can arrive late, marked by loss, but when it comes true, it can heal even the oldest wounds. If this story touched you, then you'll be moved even more by the ones to come. Subscribe to our channel and tell us where you're listening from.